Systemic racism is a painful, widespread problem in society, and even right here in Montgomery County. Though we are a welcoming community that embraces its diversity, there are still disparities that exist in ethnicity, education, income, health, and other factors that prevent our ability for future prosperity.
I want to thank all my colleagues. This resolution to develop an equity policy framework in county government.
In recognizing this, the County Council, led by President Nancy Navarro and now County Executive Marc Elrich, developed a resolution that would create an equity policy framework in county government.
That would require the county to question how budget and policy decisions impact equity. What we're referring to right there are particular communities are disproportionately affected in a negative way when it comes to access and when it comes to outcomes. That's why it is so important then for policymakers to have a very structural mechanism to not only examine those gaps, but understand if the decisions that we are making exacerbate or actually close those disparities.
You're dealing with policymakers, you just say, so, who's affected by this decision? I think people have just gotten used to not thinking about some of these things. Your job can get so isolated that you don't think about the long-term effects.
The Council's Office of Legislative Oversight recently released its report, Racial Equity in Government Decision-Making, which contains practices for advancing racial equity in government. In compiling this report, OLL examined census data compiled by the Urban Institute for Montgomery County, which revealed wide racial disparities in several areas here. Income, home ownership, and education.
So in the case of the achievement gap, of course, we know that African American and Latino students do not do as well as their white or Asian counterparts. So what does that mean in a county, for example, a public school system where Latino students are the majority and where we know that we have an ambitious goal of economic development and workforce development? These are students that are not going to be able to necessarily become part of that vibrant workforce.
How you doing? Good.
The Council believes eliminating these disparities is an economic imperative. Work kicked off at the new year with the first in a series of racial equity training sessions for county employees provided by the Racial Equity Institute.
Way of starting 2019.
These sessions were designed to set the stage for future county legislation to address institutional racism in the way we conduct government business.
So this is really the first step, and it is to adopt legislation at the end of this year to establish an equity policy in the county. So again, every decision we make, so whether it's a land use decision, a budgetary decision, a policy decision of some kind, that is constantly examined and seen through that lens, so we can hopefully begin then to see some real progress.
In March, county leaders stood together at the Silver Spring Civic Building to kick off the creation of a racial equity and social justice policy for Montgomery County government.
Very soon I discovered that in this amazing place, there were some things that we needed to work on. There were disparities that also existed here in this place that I considered to be a model. And very soon I realized that there's more than meets the eye, and really truly consider and have deliberations that look at whether our decisions are going to exacerbate or whether they are going to close these disparities. We will be here 30 years from now.
The event was full of inspiring, eloquent words from members of the County Council.
All of us are truly created equal. We have to make sure that everyone believes that.
As well as leaders from Montgomery College, the County Planning Department, and Montgomery County Public Schools, speaking on behalf of youth in Montgomery County.
The work that Council President Navarro and the County Council and the County Executive are embarking on today is crucial to the development of the next generation, because it is exhausting to go to school in a place where you walk into an honors class and people don't think you belong there. It is exhausting to go to school in a place where none of your teachers look like you. And it is exhausting to go to school in a place where the curriculum that you're learning from is written by your former oppressors.
So we're doing things that we think will bend the curve and make a difference.
The press conference kicked off the county's first community conversation on racial equity and social justice at the Silver Spring Civic Building. More than 500 county residents came together to talk about the disparities that exist here in Montgomery County. Discussion focused on changes that could be made to address the racial and ethnic inequities in our community.
Without respecting one another, we can never accomplish.
Each group then reported out key highlights of their conversations.
We want to see more affordable housing, more accountable policing.
Our schools are separate but not equal.
We'd also like to see more community level work, having the communities be engaged in getting involved in terms of the issues surrounding racial equity.
And the successful kickoff of this campaign signaled the passion of the community in being a part of this change.
We had really an engaged group here this evening. It was standing room only. And I think what I heard is that people have a lot on their minds. And so it's wonderful. And I hope that they take this back into their networks and their neighborhoods and continue to have the conversation.
That momentum continued into conversations that took place in White Oak and Germantown.
Democracy is only a true democracy if all voices are heard.
You're talking a lot about tides raising boats. Make sure they have a boat. And if they can't swim to you, then take the boat to them.
Having leaders who look like the community they represent.
Not just education of the youth, but also of adults on how to approach people of different races.
And in April, students had the opportunity to take part in their own racial equity forum at Gaithersburg High School.
I've learned so much, not just my perspective, but your perspective. So thank you, guys.
Though talking about race and equity can be complicated,
we came up with things like self-education, develop a willingness to talk to others, even when it's an uncomfortable conversation.
It was clear through the engagement in these meetings, Montgomery County residents saw the discussion as a priority. Data was collected from each of the conversations, as well as those that were organized by residents in their own communities. Council staff gathered valuable feedback from more than 750 residents and used that information to help craft Bill 2719, the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act. The measure was introduced in September, and Council President Nancy Navarro called it the proudest day of her life.
The buy-in on this current council and in our various communities has been terrific. Working as a team of leaders, we have inspired truly courageous conversations at an auspicious time in the history of our nation and our county. I want to thank every one of my colleagues on this council for your collaboration and commitment, for your fine leadership at this crucial time. This legislation is very important.
At a press conference to discuss the bill, President Navarro was joined by her colleagues, who are all co-sponsors of the legislation, as well as other officials.
I can't wait to see the fruition of it and to be a part of the work in Montgomery County. Thank you.
The bill has several goals, including establishing an Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice in the executive branch, and it would also require each department and office to develop a racial equity and social justice plan of its own.
All of us want to work towards this goal. The reality is that unless we have structural pieces in place that force us, then we'll never be able to get to the ultimate goal that we all want, which is to see a day in Montgomery County where disparities do not exist anymore.
But what will this new policy look like, and what challenges do we have to overcome? We spoke with experts in our area who have been researching this very topic to get their thoughts. Dr. Ivory Tolson is the author of a book that unravels myths that stand in the way of racial equity in education.
So the first thing is we have to use good data, not the BS that I talk about in the book, but good data, data that's open to interpretation, data that's longitudinal, data that's nuanced, and data that has both qualitative and quantitative elements to it. The second thing we need is a thoughtful analysis. This is an analysis that's based on growth factors and indicators, that's based on comparisons in a thoughtful way. It's not just looking at an achievement gap, but looking at all students that fit a certain characteristic or criteria and looking at the success within. And then the final thing is a compassionate understanding. We need an understanding of the data that helps us to identify with the students, to think about what if my own son our daughter was struggling with this issue, how would I approach it and how would I understand it?
Dr. Courtney Ackland works in the Office of Minority Health and Health Disparities at NIH. Her research focuses on how disparities in healthcare affect minorities in the U.S.
So what you're referring to is something that we've actually started to look at, which we're referring to as structural racism. One example when we talk about structural racism is the idea that if you speak a different language, for example, are you able to get the same services? Do they have the type of resources available that are really required for the patient to understand what's being said in the healthcare setting? So we're looking at the match between the patient and the clinician, for example, as something that may not have been thought about. And so sometimes you see where you've got children translating for their parents, which is definitely not something that we prescribe as being a way of getting the best type of healthcare possible. The other part to the structural racism that I think is important to remember is how it changes the individual. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and one of the things that we know is that stress associated with racism can have serious effects on your health. And so when you take a look at that and the fact that it contributes to your mental health, it contributes to your physical health, then yes, we see these difficulties.
There are still areas across the county where housing is segregated by race.
When we're talking about getting commitments to build affordable housing,
Sparky Abraham from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund says in order to remove racial barriers, commitments to affordable housing must be clear.
We actually need to be talking about the nitty-gritty of what exactly those commitments are and what exactly affordable housing means, right? If you've got a place where the market rent for a two-bedroom is exceedingly high, as it is in much of Montgomery County, well, then there's a real question as to whether you're actually going to be integrating your community simply by making it slightly below fair market rent. And so I think, in our view, like what you really need to do is you need to get into the nitty-gritty. You need to get concessions. You need to, where you're providing incentives for building, you need to make sure that those incentives are coming with conditions that are really meaningfully going to integrate the community, that are going to bring people of different income brackets, of different races into community together. And I think, one large picture thought over all of this is that study after study has shown that when people live in diverse communities, it decreases the instances of bias.
In the area of wealth, the median white household will own 86 times more wealth than its black counterpart and 68 times more than its Latino one.
Well, part of thinking about the wealth gap, part of it is thinking about the history of why that gap exists.
Dr. Rashawn Ray is a sociology professor at the University of Maryland. He talks about options that could work in reducing the racial wealth gap.
That racial gap that exists was created by our federal, state, and local governments, and we have to admit that. And there has to be some type of reparations in place for that type of process happening. People have came up with a lot of ideas. One way to think about it is to think about the areas that have been historically redlined and give them opportunities to get down payment assistance for homes. And part of thinking about assistance suggests that they're getting a handout, right? Or some sort of hand up. We shouldn't necessarily just frame it as assistance. Instead, we should think about it as this is a repayment for the fact that people haven't been able to build wealth before. So the framing of it and what we call it is extremely, extremely important. So the down payment assistance is key. I think we can also think about student loan forgiveness. If, particularly people who have college degrees and advanced degrees, did not have such substantial student loan debt, then they would actually be investing in their local communities in different ways. They would be starting businesses. They would be more likely to purchase homes. They would do things that lead to more clean energy and environmentally friendly type of products. So part of it is thinking about things more collectively about the sort of things that we can do to close the racial wealth gap.
Racial equity means that we no longer see disparities based on race, and we improve results for all groups.
What the county council, and especially under Nancy Navarro's leadership, has really left a legacy for the next group of folks to build on.
Something Montgomery County Council President Nancy Navarro and her fellow members have embraced to leverage significant change.
I hope that we will always choose not to fall into complacency by really looking at each other, acknowledging our shared humanity, and demonstrating to our children and our young people that hope, love, and justice is and must be possible.